Hey everyone, today I'm going to talk about the impact of the Revolutionary War on America. I'm not going to go into the specifics of the battles of the war because it's pretty unlikely that you'll have to write about this, but I would still briefly study them just in case. So there might be a multiple choice question about them. Just some of the big ones might be good to just briefly look over. But if you're going to have to write about the revolution, which they do ask quite a bit of questions about the revolution and its impact on the United States or the causes, which I did in a previous video. So let's go ahead and look at the impact. First, most revolutions change society super drastically. If you remember studying the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution last year, their societies changed significantly. That's why it's called a revolution. But this is not the case for the United States. They still had self-government, which is something they had beforehand. They still had the same jobs. They had a similar lifestyle. They did get rid of a king, but it was a king for the most part, somebody who was pretty literally was not super involved in their lives. So that is not a significant change. It is a change, but it is not a drastic change. But after the war, they did need to start thinking about these ideas of republicanism or freedoms that would be given to certain people. So after the British lost the war, the loyalists, those who were loyal to the crown during the revolution, were forced to leave America. They were mostly the wealthy class, so this left room for other people who were patriots to fill that role. So it also allowed for the ideas written in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal to begin spreading across the United States. Most states reduced the property requirement to vote, although they didn't get rid of it completely, but that did also allow more people to get involved in the political process. Pennsylvania and Georgia allowed all taxpayers to vote, and anyone moving into the West became property owners, so that easily gave them the right to vote as well. So we're talking about more political participation or more rights given to more people. Ordinary men and women demanded to be addressed as Mr. and Mrs., which were titles that only the wealthy highborn had previously had. So we see more equality in that way. They stopped calling their employers master and instead began to call them boss. They also got rid of laws that said all of a father's property would be passed down to the firstborn son. So again, this is giving more equality, more of the wealth to more of their children, which means the wealth could be spread out further. And in Pennsylvania and Vermont, they even banned slavery, but there is a huge contradiction over equality and slavery. So even though slavery was banned in some regions, that does not mean there was no discrimination and racism. There were similar issues with women. Some women actually disguised themselves as men and fought in the war. We're talking about a small number here, but there is some evidence of that. And some of them took care of their farms while the men were away fighting, which is a similar theme we'll see in the World Wars. In New Jersey, they actually gave women the right to vote in 1776, but unfortunately, they took that away in 1807. The ability to divorce does improve a little bit, so some women are able to get away from bad or abusive relationships. But the key thing about women afterwards is this idea of Republican motherhood. After the revolution, the idea of civic virtue became important, which is the idea that democracy relied on each person committing to doing public good. So in America, they turned to the women for this role. They expected the women to teach their husbands, their children, their sons, daughters, everybody about this idea of civic virtue, which is now called Republican motherhood. Women had more educational opportunities because of this idea of Republican motherhood, because if they're required to teach their family, they have to be able to read and write. And though the jobs stayed the same for like typical female roles, their status in society was elevated because they were seen as holding this important responsibility of helping the new nation survive. Let's talk now about the basic rights that the war brought into the United States. So the first is religious toleration, which became more widespread after the war. Instead of just being guaranteed in just a few colonies, it's now spread across the states. There's states now that the war is over. All people had freedom of movement, meaning they could move west if they wanted to, or to the south, or to the north. Nothing was stopping them from moving where they desired. They could move to a new state if they wanted. This freedom of movement helped with social mobility, which is the idea that people are no longer stuck as peasants or in the poorer class. Instead, they can work their way up to the higher class or the wealthier class. And this is a topic, an idea that is very American in thinking, and we're going to continue to talk about this in future units, especially during the time of industrialization. After the war, Americans were concerned about one person, like a king, having too much power. So they actually limited the power of the governors and gave more power to their state legislatures. So a group of people instead of just one person. So we're talking about the Congress having more power than the president, although this is going to change over time as we continue to talk about the growth of the federal government. And they guaranteed specific rights in their state constitutions like freedom of religion, speech, and trial by jury. So there are more rights guaranteed to the people after the revolution, even though we talked earlier about there not being significantly drastic changes. They did similar things with the federal or the national government, although this has some problems, which we will discuss later. The Founding Fathers, when they wrote the Articles of Confederation, intentionally made it weak. They didn't want another king telling them what to do. They had no executive branch or judicial branch, so they could not tax, regulate trade, or raise an army. We'll talk about later in the Articles of Confederation video why this is a problem. But at first, the change is significant in the sense that they want the government to be weaker. Ultimately, the American Revolution wasn't as radical as other revolutions because they didn't have as many problems to begin with. In fact, they had less taxes and more freedom than most people in Europe. They simply had a small change in government structure, but their daily lifestyles after the war didn't change that much. There are a couple other impacts of the war that I would like you to be aware of. First, the loyalists who supported King George during the war were considered traitors, and many of them lost their property and were forced to leave or just chose to leave for safety reasons or other. So 60,000 actually moved back to Great Britain, and another 40,000 moved to Canada. Quakers were not treated well because they were pacifists and refused to take part in the war, so there was some issues with that. Native Americans now had to deal with Americans moving west past that old proclamation line because now there is nothing stopping them. The redcoats are no longer there to enforce that line. It doesn't exist anymore because of the war. And so we know this is going to devastate their tribes later on. And Catholics actually had better treatment after the war because Spain and France, which were Catholic nations, sided with the United States during the Revolution. So we do see an improvement in that area. I'm going to leave you with this practice prompt from the 2019 exam, and this time it's a short answer question which has 2 documents that you have to compare. This is a format that the AP test uses often. I would almost guarantee you will see one short answer question that looks just like this format where you're comparing 2 documents and answering questions about them. So I would make sure you spend some time looking through this and really trying to answer these on your notes so that you can practice that idea. So I'd say pause the video here so you have some time to look at the documents and answer the questions, or at least think through your response. And when you're done, check the description below to make sure that you've got those answers correct and your analysis correct. I hope you guys have a great day studying, and I will see you in class.